The morning Clara Whitmore turned 19, her stepmother sold her. Not in whispers, not with shame. Margaret Whitmore stood in the middle of their kitchen, counted the gold coins a stranger laid on the table, and smiled like she'd just sold a lame horse she'd been feeding too long. "You're more trouble than you're worth," Margaret said, not even looking at Clara when she said it. "At least this way you pay for yourself." The man across the table, a trader with tobacco-stained fingers and no particular expression, glanced at Clara the way a person glances at furniture. Useful or not? That was the only question. Clara stood in the doorway holding a flour sack that contained everything she owned. She was 19 years old. She had nowhere to go and no one who would come looking for her if she disappeared. And somewhere deep in the Wyoming mountains, a man she had never met was apparently expecting her. If you've ever felt like you were invisible to the very people who were supposed to love you, keep watching. Because this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit like, leave a comment with your city or country, and let us know how far this story has traveled. Part 1. The coins. Margaret Whitmore counted that morning, were not hidden. She set each one on the kitchen table slowly, deliberately, the way a person does when they want to be seen doing something satisfying. 12 gold pieces. A sack of dried goods stacked beside the door. 2 bolts of fabric the trader had brought as sweetener. Clara watched from the doorway and did not speak. She had learned early that speaking in this house cost more than silence. When she was 14 and made the mistake of crying at the dinner table after a particularly bad week, Margaret had looked at her with such complete exhaustion that Clara felt the shame of her own tears more than whatever had caused them. After that, she practiced keeping her face still. It wasn't hard. Stillness was just another kind of disappearing, and Clara had been disappearing since her father's coffin went into the ground 3 years before. The trader's name was Dennison. He wore a brown duster coat with a dark stain near the collar, and he smelled like horses and wood smoke. He didn't speak much either, which Clara might have appreciated under different circumstances. He simply moved through the transaction with professional efficiency, checking items against some private list in his head, and when the count was settled, he looked at Margaret and said, "She'll need to be ready by first light." "She's ready now," Margaret said. Clara looked at the sack she was holding. Inside was a spare dress, a wool shawl, a small folding knife her father had given her before he got sick, and a photograph of him taken when he was still well enough to stand straight. That was the full inventory of her life. It fit in a flour sack with room to spare. Dennison glanced at her then, just briefly. Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it. Not quite pity. More like the look a man gives when he's seen enough of the world to know something is wrong but has decided it's not his problem. He looked away and began moving toward the door. "Where am I going?" Clara asked. It was the first thing she'd said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Margaret was already folding the fabric, smoothing the edge with her thumb. "Elias Boone's place, up in the Grantham Range." She said it the way you'd say the name of a road, pure information, nothing attached. "I don't know him." "No reason you would. He doesn't come down much." Margaret finally looked at her then, and Clara saw in her stepmother's eyes something she hadn't seen in a long time. Relief. Plain and unguarded. "He needed a wife. You needed a place. It's a practical arrangement. Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I owe you something." Margaret's voice hardened. "I fed you for 3 years, Clara. 3 years after your father left me nothing but debt and a girl nobody wanted. You should be thanking me." Clara didn't thank her. She picked up her sack and walked out the front door. The town of Silver Creek watched her leave. This was not an exaggeration. She walked down the main road toward Dennison's wagon, and the street was not empty. There were women outside the dry goods store, 2 men leaning on the rail outside the saloon at that early hour, a cluster of children she recognized from church. They watched the way people watch something they've already decided how to feel about. A few of them whispered. One woman, Mrs. Calloway, who had once told Clara's father what a shame it was that his daughter had his mother's build instead of her own, pressed her lips together and shook her head slowly, the gesture of a woman confirming something she'd long suspected. Clara kept her chin level and looked straight ahead. She was good at that walk. She had walked it her whole life. The walk where you feel every set of eyes like a hand pushing on your back and you refuse to stumble. She had walked it down school hallways and into church and through the town market where boys 2 years younger than her thought it was entertainment to call after her. The walk where you perform not caring until you're good enough at the performance that sometimes you almost believe it yourself. She climbed up onto Dennison's wagon bench without help and arranged her sack between her feet. "You got a blanket?" Dennison asked, not looking at her. "No." He reached behind the bench without a word and dropped a rough wool blanket on her lap. Then he clicked to the horses and the wagon started moving. Clara did not look back at Silver Creek. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she kept that promise, though it cost her something she didn't have a name for. A town is a town even when it treats you badly. You know its mud and its morning sounds, and which boards creak on which porch. Leaving it is a kind of loss even when staying was worse. The mountains ahead were blue and enormous in the early light. She had never been this close to the Grantham Range before. From town it looked like a painting, something decorative and distant. Up close, riding toward it, it looked like a wall, like the edge of the world. Dennison was not a cruel man. Clara had braced for cruelty and found instead a person who simply did not speak very much, and seemed to regard unnecessary conversation the same way he regarded unnecessary weight in a wagon, a burden with no payoff. He stopped twice in the morning hours to water the horses. He offered her jerked meat at midday without comment. When the trail narrowed into genuine wilderness and the trees closed in on both sides, and Clara gripped the bench edge without meaning to, he said, without looking at her, "Trail gets rough here for maybe 2 miles. It opens back up." That was more information than she'd expected. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. The horses picked their way over the rocky stretch. She found herself thinking about her father. His name had been Robert Whitmore, and he was a man who laughed easily and cried at sad songs and grew the best corn in the county for 9 straight years. He had never once in his life made Clara feel like her body was a problem. He called her his mountain girl, not because of her size, but because of her stubbornness, which he seemed to regard as a virtue. When other children were cruel to her, he would sit with her on the porch and say, "Clara, the loudest voices in a room are usually the emptiest ones. You remember that." She had tried to remember it. Some days it held. Other days the loudest voices were louder than the memory of him. He got sick in the winter of her 16th year. By spring, he was gone. Margaret had come 2 years before the sickness, entering their house with a kind of careful efficiency that Clara had initially mistaken for steadiness. Margaret was not an evil woman in any dramatic sense. She didn't beat Clara or lock her away or say terrible things in a theatrical voice. She simply made it clear, in 100 small and consistent ways, that Clara was a problem she had inherited and not one she intended to spend much energy on. When food was rationed, Clara's portions were rationed more. When work was distributed, Clara's share was distributed more. When men came calling, there had been 2, briefly, neither of whom had anything serious in mind. Margaret found ways to make sure they understood Clara was not a serious option. "You're a good worker," Margaret had said to her once, and Clara had understood clearly that this was the complete list of her worth in that house. She turned the folding knife over in her pocket. She kept it there, her thumb running over the handle, just to feel something familiar. They reached the lower foothills by late afternoon, and the trail that had been rough became something closer to suggestion. Dennison pulled the wagon to a stop at a place where the path divided, one track going up and one going along the ridge. "He'll come down to meet us," Dennison said. "He knew we were coming." "You've done this before," Clara said. It came out before she decided to say it. Dennison was quiet for a moment. "Delivered supplies up to him twice. He doesn't ask for much." He paused. "He's not what people say." Clara looked at him. He was already looking at the trail, jaw working slightly. "What do people say?" she asked. "That he's dangerous, that he killed a man once in the mountains and no one could prove it, that he's not right in the head, living up there alone all these years." Dennison shrugged one shoulder. "People need stories to explain what they don't understand." "And what do you understand about him?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which she hadn't expected. "I understand he always has the right money ready. He doesn't haggle, and the last time I came up here, he'd left a basket of smoked fish at the trail marker for the Hendersons 3 miles south, because their mother was sick, and he knew they wouldn't make it to town for supplies." He clicked to the horses. "Make of that what you will." Clara made of it what she could, which wasn't much. A man who left fish baskets for sick neighbors was not the monster the town described. But it also wasn't a husband, and she still didn't know what it meant that she was riding toward him in a wagon with everything she owned in a flour sack. He came down the trail on a dark bay horse, alone. She saw him from a distance first, a big man, broader through the shoulders than most, sitting straight in the saddle with the ease of someone who had spent more time on a horse than off one. As he got closer, she could make out the particulars. Dark beard, not trimmed so much as maintained, jaw like something you'd find in the geology of the mountains themselves, a canvas coat worn through at the elbows, eyes that moved across her and the wagon with the practiced scan of someone assessing a situation before deciding how to enter it. He reined up next to Dennison without theatrics. "You made good time," he said. "Road was clear," Dennison said. They shook hands. This was apparently the full extent of their reunion. Then Elias Boone looked at Clara. She looked back. She had prepared during the long ride for several versions of this moment. She had prepared for disgust, for disappointment, for the particular look she had seen on men's faces her whole life when they saw her, that quick recalculation, the rearrangement of expectations downward. She had prepared to feel it and not show that she felt it. He looked at her the way you look at a person. That was all. Direct and steady, without performance in either direction. Not approval, not rejection, just a man actually looking at the person in front of him. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "Yes." "Elias Boone." A pause. "You eat before they brought you out?" The question caught her so off guard she almost laughed. "Midday," she managed. "Dennison had jerked meat." Elias looked at Dennison with an expression that was not quite disapproval, but in that neighborhood. "I've got stew on. We'll eat when we get up." He turned the horse without waiting for a response. Dennison looked at Clara. Something in his face had relaxed slightly, the way a person looks when they've been hoping something would go a certain way, and it seems like it might. "He's not what people say," he repeated. This time it sounded less like information and more like he needed her to hear it. The cabin sat on a shelf of land below the tree line, with a view that on a clear evening showed so much sky it felt like an insult to every cramped room Clara had ever lived in. It was not a pretty cabin, it was a functional cabin, the difference being that pretty cabins are built for looking at, and functional cabins are built for surviving in, and this one had been built by someone who understood that the mountains would test every joint and every beam every winter, and hadn't wasted any effort on flourishes. Elias helped her down from the wagon without asking if she needed help. Not in the way men sometimes help women down, the performative gesture, the excuse to hold a hand, but in the practical way of someone who knows the step is high and slippery and that most people need a hand there regardless. He carried her flour sack inside himself. She stood in the main room and looked around. A rough table, 2 chairs, a fireplace with the promised stew hanging over it. A bookshelf with maybe 30 books, which surprised her. A bear hide on the floor that had seen better years. Everything in the room had the quality of something chosen for a reason. Even the clutter was purposeful clutter. "That room's yours," he said, gesturing to a door off the main space. "I'll be in the lean-to off the back until—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Just until you get your bearings. There's no arrangement that's required of you that you haven't agreed to first." She looked at him. "Margaret didn't explain much," she said carefully. I imagine she didn't. His voice didn't shift, but something in his expression did. A tightening at the corner of his mouth that told her he knew what Margaret was and hadn't thought much of the transaction either. "I needed help with the place. Someone who could manage it when I'm out trapping. Dennison knew of your situation and thought—" He stopped again. He seemed to be a man who said things in drafts, editing himself as he went. "I know what was told to you about me. Most of it isn't true." "Most of it?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Sit down. I'll get the stew." She didn't sleep that first night. She lay in the room he'd given her, a real room with a real door that latched, which was more than she'd had at Margaret's house, where her room was a curtained alcove off the kitchen, and listened to the mountain. It was not quiet. She had assumed mountains would be quiet, but the Grantham Range at night was a constant low conversation of wind and animals, and the deep structural sounds of a wilderness that did not stop for darkness. She held her father's knife. She thought about the look on Margaret's face when she counted those coins. The relief. The particular relaxation of a person setting down something they've been carrying too long. Clara had known intellectually that she was unwanted in that house, but there is a distance between knowing a thing and watching it demonstrated with gold coins on a kitchen table, and she was discovering that crossing that distance took longer than a single night in a mountain cabin. She was also thinking, against her will, about Elias Boone. She had not expected the books. She had not expected the fish baskets left for sick neighbors. She had not expected a man who would tell her, with no particular warmth, just plain directness, that nothing was required of her without her agreement. She had built a picture of this mountain man from everything people said about him, and the person who had handed her a bowl of decent stew and talked to her about the garden she might want to plant in spring bore almost no resemblance to that picture. This frightened her more than the monster would have. Monsters she knew how to handle. She had been handling them her whole life by making herself small and still and silent. A man who looked at her like a person required an entirely different set of skills, and she wasn't sure she had them. Outside, something moved in the trees, something large and unhurried. She gripped the knife. Then she heard Elias's voice, distant, from the direction of the lean-to. Not words exactly, more like a sound made for the animal's benefit, low and even, the way you talk to something you want to calm without spooking. Whatever it was settled and moved on. She listened to the quiet that came after. Then she put the knife under her pillow, pulled the blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes. She did not trust this place yet. She did not trust this man. She did not trust the particular tightness in her chest that came from someone treating her like she was worth feeding and housing and speaking directly to. But she was here. And whatever came next, she had survived the night. The mountains kept their conversation going outside her window, and eventually, against everything she expected of herself, Clara Whitmore fell asleep. She was bad at it for the first 2 weeks. That was the honest truth of it, and Clara had learned early that there was no profit in lying to yourself about your own shortcomings. She burned the first 3 meals she attempted on the iron stove, which ran hotter than the one at Margaret's house, and had its own particular temperament about what it would and would not cooperate with. She misjudged the garden soil, planting the early seeds too shallow in ground that was still cold at the root level, and Elias found her crouched over the rows one morning looking at seeds that hadn't moved in a week with the expression of someone reviewing their own failures. He crouched beside her without being asked. "Too early for these," he said, not unkindly. "Ground still holding winter 3 inches down. Another 2 weeks and the soil will be ready. I planted them last week." "I know. I saw." He picked up a small handful of the dark soil and let it fall through his fingers. "Frost killed the roots before they had a chance. It happens. You didn't know the ground up here yet." "You could have told me." He was quiet for a moment, which she had come to understand was not evasion, but simply the way he processed things. Thoughts moved through Elias Boone the way water moved through rock, slowly and with pressure. "You didn't ask," he finally said, "and you seemed like someone who needed to find things out for yourself." She looked at him. "That's a generous way of saying you let me fail on purpose." "It's an accurate way of saying it." There was something in his voice, not humor exactly, but adjacent to it, something dry and inward. "I learned more from this mountain by failing than by any other method. Figured you might be the same kind of person." She sat back on her heels. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that had given up being winter but hadn't fully committed to spring, and her breath came out in small clouds. "What if I'm not?" "Then I'd have told you about the soil 2 weeks ago." He stood. "I'll replant with you on Friday. There's a way to test the depth of the cold. I'll show you." He walked back toward the cabin, and that was the end of the conversation. Clara stayed by the garden rows a while longer, her hands in her lap, looking at the ground that had quietly killed everything she'd tried to grow. She was not sure if she was angry or grateful or something complicated that lived between those two things. What she was sure of was that no one had ever before told her that her failure was a reasonable part of learning something. Margaret's household operated on a simpler philosophy. You either did the thing correctly or you demonstrated your fundamental inadequacy as a person. Elias Boone apparently operated on a different theory entirely. She was not sure yet what to do with that. The stove she figured out by the end of the first week, which restored some of her confidence. It required a specific combination of airflow and wood arrangement that was different from what she knew, but once she understood its logic, she found she could work with it. The bread she made on the 8th day was dense and slightly uneven, but it was bread, genuinely edible bread, and when she set it on the table that evening, Elias tore off a piece and ate it without comment. She waited. "Good," he said. "It's lopsided." "Tastes the same lopsided." She sat across from him and ate her own portion. The cabin was quiet in the evenings, not uncomfortably so. She had discovered that silence in this house was not hostile the way it had been in Margaret's. Margaret's silences were statements. They meant, "You are tolerated here." Elias's silences were simply the natural state of a man who did not feel the need to fill space with words that weren't doing any work. "You said there were books," she said. He looked at the shelf. 32. Take whatever you want." "Did you read all of them?" "Most of them twice." She looked at the shelf herself. The titles were a strange assortment: A Natural History of North American Birds, 2 volumes of frontier surveying guides, a novel she didn't recognize, 3 books on plant medicine, a collection of stories, an atlas worn down to bare boards on its cover. Where did they come from? "Accumulated. It did. Over time." He paused. "My wife had some of them." The word wife landed in the room without warning. Clara looked at him. He was looking at his plate. "You were married before," she said. It was not exactly a question. "Yes." She waited, knowing now the particular weight of his silences well enough to understand that this one was carrying something heavy. "She's gone," he said, 7 years ago. Then before she could offer the usual words that people offer in those situations, words he had clearly received enough of to find them useless, he pushed back from the table and said, "I'll check the traps before dark," and went out. Clara sat at the table alone. The fire worked behind its grate. She looked at his empty plate and then at the bookshelf, at the books his wife had owned, and she understood something she hadn't before: that this mountain and this cabin were not just where Elias Boone lived. They were where he had carried something he couldn't put down and had been carrying it alone for 7 years. She picked up the novel from the shelf. The spine cracked when she opened it. Someone had written a name on the inside cover in careful letters: Eleanor. Clara closed it gently and set it back exactly where she'd found it. She found her rhythm in the 3rd week, the way you find your footing on uneven ground, not all at once, but in small adjustments, one step at a time, until you stop thinking about balance and start thinking about where you're going. Mornings, she made coffee and the first meal while Elias was already out checking the trap lines. He was up before light. She would hear him moving in the lean-to, the low sound of him talking to the horses, the particular creak of the outer door, and gone by the time she had the stove going. She had stopped waiting for him the first few days. Now she simply prepared enough for 2 and kept his portion warm. He always came back by mid-morning. He always ate what she made without complaint, which she had learned by now was not indifference, but a specific kind of respect. The respect of a man who understood that someone had worked to put food in front of him and wasn't going to squander that work by making demands about it. After breakfast, he worked around the property. She worked beside him more often than not, because there was always work, and because she had discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that physical labor in a place that was hers to maintain felt completely different from physical labor in a place where she was tolerated. At Margaret's house, every chore she completed was evidence of her debt. Here, every chore she completed was evidence of her capability. The difference was not small. She learned to mend fence posts. She learned how Elias organized the root cellar, which, she pointed out one afternoon, made no logical sense, and had the argument with him about it that resulted in reorganizing it entirely her way, which turned out to be more efficient, a fact he acknowledged by saying nothing and simply using the new system without complaint. She chose to take that as a concession. She planted the garden on the Friday he'd promised, her hands in the soil while he crouched nearby and showed her how to test the temperature at depth by pressing her knuckle against the ground at 3 and 4 inches. "Like this," he said, demonstrating. She tried it. "I can feel it. Still cold." "Move 18 inches that way. Different drainage on that side." She moved and tested again. "Warmer." "That's where you start." She started there. What? It was near the end of that 3rd week that she met Hattie Drummond. Hattie came up the trail on a spotted mule with the easy authority of someone who had made this particular trip more times than she could count. She was a woman in her late 50s with gray hair pinned under a battered hat and the face of someone who had lived outdoors for most of her life and found the experience largely agreeable. She brought 4 pounds of salt and 2 copies of a week's-old newspaper and an opinion about everything, delivered without invitation. She looked Clara up and down the moment she got off the mule, with the frank assessment of someone who has no patience for social performance. "You're the Whitmore girl," she said. "Clara." Hattie Drummond. "I run the post for the lower range families. Elias around?" "Checking the far traps. He'll be back by noon." Hattie handed her the salt and the newspapers and tied the mule to the post. "Then I'll wait. You got coffee?" She did have coffee. They sat at the rough table and Hattie drank with the appreciation of someone who had been in the saddle since before sunrise. She looked around the cabin with an eye that missed nothing. "Place looks better," she said. "He had the root cellar backwards for 6 years. Who fixed it?" "I did." Hattie made a sound that was not quite approval, but in that general direction. "Good. Someone needed to." She took another drink. "How are you finding it up here?" Clara considered the question honestly. "Strange," she said. "Good strange, mostly. Different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something worse." Hattie nodded as though this confirmed something she already knew. "Town talk about Elias has been ugly for years. People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand a man who chooses to live away from them." She set her cup down. "He's not a monster. He's a man who had his heart broken by the mountains and then stayed anyway because he didn't have anywhere else that felt like his." Clara thought about the name written on the inside cover of the novel, Eleanor. "He doesn't talk much about his wife," she said carefully. "No, he wouldn't." Hattie's voice softened fractionally. "Not much, but enough." She was something. Sharp and funny, and she loved this mountain the way some women love their children. She got sick in the second winter they were up here. Fever that came fast and didn't leave. By the time anyone could get a doctor up the trail, Hattie stopped. Elias blamed himself for years. Thought he should have brought her to town sooner. Thought if they'd lived closer to people, she'd have had a better chance. She picked up her cup. Maybe. Maybe not. Fever like that took people in town too, but he doesn't think about it that way. Clara was quiet. "He reached out to Dennison about a wife," Hattie continued, without any particular delicacy about it, "because he needed help with the place, and because I think, somewhere under all that quiet, he's tired of being alone. But he wouldn't know how to say that. So instead he made a practical arrangement." She looked at Clara directly. "Don't mistake the practical arrangement for the whole truth of what he needs." Clara didn't have a response to that. She was still turning it over when Elias came back through the door, stopped when he saw Hattie, and said, "You're early this month." "I was in the area. Clara made good coffee." He looked at Clara with something that was not quite surprise. "Did she?" "Don't sound like that. Sit down. I have news from the lower range." The news Hattie brought was the first sign of what was coming, though none of them understood it as a sign at the time. A stagecoach had been robbed 3 weeks back on the Eastern Road, 2 days' ride from the Grantham foothills. 4 passengers stripped of their valuables, the driver pistol whipped badly enough to lose hearing in one ear. The men responsible had ridden into the foothills afterward and hadn't been seen since. The territorial deputy, a man named Holt, who Hattie described as competent but understaffed, had tracked them to the edge of the mountain range and then lost the trail. "How many men?" Elias asked. 7, by the driver's count. Could be more. Hattie unfolded one of the newspapers and pushed it across the table. "They're calling them the Black Coyote Riders. Name's been in the papers for 4 months. They hit a mining company payroll in the Dakotas in October. Bank in Nebraska in January. This is the 3rd job we know about." Elias looked at the newspaper without picking it up. "Who leads them?" "Man named Silas Crow. Used to be a Union scout if the papers are right. Knows terrain, knows how to move men through wild country without leaving easy tracks." Hattie's voice was careful. "Which is why the deputy thinks they might be sheltering in the upper range. Someone up here knows these mountains well enough to keep 7 men hidden." The sentence settled in the room. Clara looked at Elias. The set of his jaw had changed in a way she was starting to learn how to read, a tightening that happened when he was calculating something he didn't like the calculation of. "He thinks it's me," Elias said. "He thinks it could be you, or someone you know." Hattie looked at him steadily. "I told him that was nonsense. But nonsense doesn't stop a deputy with limited options from looking in the most obvious direction. I've never had anything to do with outlaws. I know that. He'll learn it too, if he's worth his badge." Hattie folded the newspaper and tucked it back under her arm. I'm telling you because you should be aware that there are dangerous men somewhere in these mountains. And because if Holt comes up here asking questions, you should be straight with him and not give him any reason to complicate things. Elias nodded once. That was all. After Hattie left, the cabin held a different quality of silence than its usual kind. Clara washed the cups and thought about 7 armed men in the mountains above her. She thought about how wide the Grantham Range was, how many valleys and ridges and hidden places there were between here and the peaks. She thought about how the trail Dennison had used to bring her up was apparently the main route, which meant anyone moving through this range who wanted to stay unseen would use a different route. She thought about the fact that Elias knew those routes better than anyone. Do you know where they'd hide? She asked. He was sitting at the table, looking at nothing in particular. I know every ridge and canyon in 20 miles. If someone wanted to shelter a group of men up here without being seen, I can think of 4 places they might use. He looked at her. And I'm going to check all 4 tomorrow. She turned from the sink. Alone? I ride these trails alone. You ride them without 7 armed men possibly on them. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has been alone long enough that someone else's concern takes a moment to process. I'll be careful, he said. That's not the same thing as not going alone. He did not answer that, which she was also learning was not disagreement, but a kind of acknowledgement. He got up and went to the corner of the room where his rifle lived on its pegs and checked it with the automatic thoroughness of a man maintaining something he depended on. Clara dried her hands on the cloth and thought about how 3 weeks ago she had arrived on this mountain in a flour sack with everything she owned, and now she was standing in a cabin that felt, in a way she couldn't fully explain, like somewhere she was supposed to be, and she was worried, genuinely worried, about the man who lived in it. That was a new feeling. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she set it aside and started thinking about what kind of supper she could put together for the morning before he left. He came back from his scouting the following evening with mud to his knees and a look on his face that told her the mountain had confirmed something he hadn't wanted confirmed. 2 of the 4 places, he said, before she could ask. He sat at the table and pulled off his boots. There was a long scrape across his right forearm that she hadn't seen when he left. Signs of a camp, fire rings, horse tracks, some refuse. One location probably used 2 weeks back, the other more recent. Somebody's been moving between them. She heated water without being asked and set a cloth on the table near him. He looked at it. Something crossed his face that he didn't show often, something that was not quite gratitude but was in the neighborhood of it, the expression of a person receiving care they're not accustomed to and don't entirely know what to do with. He cleaned the arm himself methodically. The deputy needs to know, she said. I'll send a word with Hattie on her next pass, or ride down myself. When's Hattie's next pass? 10 days? Maybe 12? That's a long time if there are men up here. I know it. He was quiet. Then, I found something else. She waited. One of the sites, the more recent one, there were marks cut into a tree, not random, a pattern. He put his hands flat on the table. Someone's marking the trail system, like they're learning the routes, making a map they can read on the move. Clara sat down across from him. The fire was behind her, warm on her back. They're planning something else, not just hiding. Seems like they need a guide, someone who already knows the routes. He looked at her steadily. Yes. And you're the only person they know of who fits that description. The only person with a known location and a name attached to it. His voice was flat, factual. If Silas Crow is half what the papers say he is, he'll have asked around about who lives in this range. My name would come up quickly. The implication of that sat between them on the table like something with weight and shape. They'll come here, Clara said. Maybe. Eventually. He looked at the rifle on the wall. I've handled difficult men before. This cabin has good sight lines. I know every approach. You keep saying you've handled things before, alone. You keep saying it like I'm not here. He stopped and looked at her. She wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something more specific than anger, the frustration of being discounted by someone who wasn't doing it out of malice, but simply out of habit. The habit of solitude. The habit of I manage myself. I know you're here, he said, then act like it. The silence that followed was different from his usual kind. She could see him working through something, not the tactical problem, but the other thing, the harder thing, the part about letting another person into the calculations you've been making alone for years. "All right," he said finally. Just that. 2 words. But she understood they cost him something. Hot. Ze began to learn the mountain properly in the weeks that followed. Not the surface of it, not the garden and the trails she could see from the cabin door, but the actual terrain. Elias taught her in the way he taught everything, by doing it alongside her and letting her make decisions, and correcting only when the decision would genuinely hurt her. He showed her the signal system he'd built over years, specific arrangements of stones at certain trail junctions that meant different things depending on how you came to them. One pattern meant danger ahead, another meant the trail was clear. A third was a directional marker pointing toward the cabin. She learned the landmarks by their shapes and their positions relative to each other, not by their names because many of them didn't have names. The forked pine at the second ridge, the rock outcropping above the North Canyon that looked from a certain angle like a seated figure, the creek crossing where the current ran stronger than it appeared and had apparently thrown Elias himself off his feet twice in his earlier years up here. "Twice," she repeated. "The second time I should have known better." He sounded more irritated with himself than embarrassed. "The first time you can blame inexperience, the second time you're just not paying attention." She filed that away, not the fact of the creek, but the principle underneath it, that he held himself accountable for his own mistakes without self-pity or excessive drama. She had grown up in a house where mistakes were either someone else's fault or proof of fundamental unworthiness. The middle ground, you made an error, you own it, you do better, was a way of operating she was still learning. She was learning a great many things. She learned that Elias woke from nightmares sometimes, though he never spoke of them. She heard him one night through the wall, not crying, nothing that vulnerable, just a sudden sharp sound and then footsteps and the outer door opening and the sounds of him outside for a long time. She lay in her room and did not go out, understanding somehow that company was not what he needed in those moments. Just space. Just the dark and the mountain. She learned that he had a particular way of sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, when the light changed and the shadows from the peaks stretched long and the air cooled and the birds did their evening count. He sat in the same chair in the same position and looked at the same view, and she began to understand, after enough evenings of watching from the doorway, that this was not idleness. This was the only version of rest this man allowed himself. She started sitting in the other chair. Not to talk, just to be there. He did not tell her to go inside. After the second evening, he stopped looking over when she came out and simply moved his eyes back to the view, which she understood as a kind of acceptance. They sat in the late light, 2 people who had arrived at this mountain from very different kinds of wreckage, and watched the world do what it did every evening without help from either of them. She had been on the mountain for 6 weeks when the first real test came. Not Silas Crow, not the outlaws, but something smaller and in some ways harder. A letter arrived with Hattie's second visit, written in a hand Clara knew before she turned it over. Margaret Whitmore, Silver Creek. She did not open it at the table. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened it there, alone, with the particular bracing of a person about to receive something they know will cost them. It was not long. Margaret was not a woman who wasted words on paper any more than she'd wasted warmth in person. Clara, Dennison tells me you are settling in well enough. I write to let you know that your cousin Vera has taken your old room, which you will not be needing back. I also write to inform you that your father's pocket watch, which I found in the bottom of the chest after you left, will be kept here as fair compensation for the costs of your upbringing, which were considerable. I trust you understand the logic of this. Ms. Whitmore. Clara read it twice. She read it a third time, more slowly, looking at the line about the pocket watch. Her father's pocket watch. The one he had inherited from his own father. The one he had showed her once on a Sunday when she was maybe 8 years old. The case open, the small hand moving, explaining to her in his patient way how the mechanism worked. The one thing of his she had most wanted. She folded the letter very carefully along its existing creases. Then she sat with it in her hands for a long time. She was not going to cry. Not about Margaret. She had spent enough of herself on Margaret's particular arithmetic, the constant calculation of what Clara was worth and what she owed, and she was done contributing to it. The watch was gone. The room was taken. These were facts, and Margaret had arranged them to feel like verdicts, but they were only facts. What Clara felt, sitting on the edge of that bed, was something closer to clarity than grief. The final account had been settled. There was nothing left to go back for. She put the letter in the bottom of her flour sack, under the spare dress, where she did not have to look at it. When she came back out to the main room, Elias was at the table with Hattie, talking about the outlaw signs he'd found and the message he'd sent down to Deputy Holt. He looked at her when she came in, a quick, direct look, the same look he'd given her the first day, and she could see him register something in her face, and she could see him decide not to ask about it in front of Hattie. Later, after Hattie left and the cabin had settled back into its evening rhythm, he said, from across the room, without looking up from the harness he was mending, "You don't have to tell me anything, but if you want to say it out loud, I'm here." She thought about that. "My stepmother took my father's watch," she said it was compensation. He was quiet. "I know it's only an object," she said. "I know it doesn't—" "It's not only an object," he said, flat and certain. "And you know that." She looked at him. "Eleanor's books," he said by way of explanation. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She had seen his face the one time she'd accidentally shifted one of Eleanor's books to a different shelf. Just for a moment, just briefly, before he'd put the expression away. She understood what he meant. Some objects carry a person inside them, and losing the object is a particular kind of loss that has no clean name. She nodded. He went back to the harness. They said nothing else about it. But she went to sleep that night feeling, for the first time since she'd arrived, that she was not only being tolerated or managed or given charity. She was being understood, and by someone who had no particular reason to try. It was Hattie who brought the warning 10 days after her last visit, arriving at a hard trot that told Clara before the woman even stopped the mule that something had changed. "Holt sent word," Hattie said, dismounting with the urgency of someone who had not ridden this trail for pleasant reasons. 2 of the Crow gang were seen at the Brennan Crossing, 4 miles below the lower trail. They weren't moving away from the mountains. They were moving deeper in. Elias was already at the door. "How long ago?" "Yesterday morning. Holt's coming up with 3 men. 2 days out, maybe less if the trail's good." Hattie's eyes went from Elias to Clara and back. "But 2 days is 2 days." "They're scouting the final approach," Elias said. He was not talking to either of them specifically. He was talking out loud, working through it. "If Crow sends 2 men ahead to scout the cabin location, he knows where we are. He's making his decision." "His decision to what?" Clara asked. Elias looked at her. She already knew the answer. She had known it since the night he'd said they'll come here. She had known it and set it aside because setting things aside and continuing to function was a skill she had developed out of necessity. But she could feel the edges of that held thing now pressing outward, demanding acknowledgement. 7 armed men. A man who used to be a military scout. And Elias's knowledge of every trail and canyon and hidden route in 20 miles of mountain wilderness. They were not going to ask him to guide them through politeness. "How long do we have?" she asked. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, in a distant way. If they scout today and report back tonight, Crow could move tomorrow at first light. Elias was already crossing to the corner where the rifle lived on its pegs. "We have tonight and maybe half of tomorrow." "Then we need to prepare tonight," Clara said. He looked at her again, that steady, direct look. In 6 weeks she had learned to read it better. What it said now was, "Yes, and I'm glad you're here." "Yes," he said out loud, to be sure she heard it. She was already moving toward the root cellar to start the inventory. The mountain did not care about what was coming. The evening birds made their evening sounds. The light shifted the same way it always shifted. But inside that functional, imperfect cabin, 2 people who had come to each other through the worst kinds of necessity were making ready for something that neither of them had asked for, and both of them intended to face. Whatever Silas Crow was bringing up that mountain, he was not going to find what he expected. They worked through the night, not frantically. Clara had learned enough about Elias by now to understand that panic was not part of his operating vocabulary, and she was determined not to make it part of hers either, though the effort required more conscious decision-making than she would have liked. What they did instead was move through the cabin and the property with the methodical focus of 2 people who understood that preparation was the only thing between them and whatever Silas Crow was planning to bring up the mountain. Elias started with the cabin itself. He checked every window latch, reinforced the bar on the back door. With an additional bracket he pulled from the storage shed and moved the heaviest piece of furniture, a solid oak cabinet that had no business being as heavy as it was, into a position that would slow anyone trying to force the front entrance. He worked without explaining each decision, but Clara watched and understood the logic of each one. And when he started on the shutters, she was already on the other side of the window, holding the hinge steady while he drove the new pins home. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I'm aware." He didn't argue. He moved to the next window. She had learned in 6 weeks that this was one of the more efficient ways to operate with Elias Boone. Simply do the thing and don't wait for permission, because waiting for permission was not in his natural vocabulary either, and two people who both understood what needed doing could cover twice the ground. The root cellar came next. He wanted supplies moved, not all of them, just the essentials, to a secondary location he showed her for the first time that night. Behind the woodpile at the eastern edge of the property, there was a depression in the ground that she had assumed was just uneven terrain. Elias lifted a section of fitted boards from it and revealed a shallow cache, roughly the size of a wardrobe laid on its side, lined with oilcloth and smelling of cold earth. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Built it the second winter. Before that I stored everything in the root cellar, like a man who'd never thought about what happens if someone tries to take what he stored." He handed her a wrapped parcel of dried meat. "Put this in the back corner." She worked it into the space. "You've been preparing for something like this for years." "I've been preparing for the possibility. It's different." He passed her a tin of powder. "Most of the time you prepare and nothing happens. That's the good outcome. And the bad outcome is that something happens and you're not prepared. That's one bad outcome." He looked at her briefly. "The other bad outcome is that something happens and you've prepared wrong. That one keeps me up at night more." She thought about that while she arranged tins in the cache. Outside, the mountain made its nighttime sounds. Wind in the upper trees, something moving in the middle distance, the particular deep quiet that lay under all of it like a floor. It was a different kind of night than any she had experienced in Silver Creek. In town, night was the absence of day. Up here it was its own presence, active and full of information if you knew how to listen. She was learning to listen. By midnight they had done what could be done to the cabin. Elias spread a rough map on the table, not a printed map, something he'd drawn himself over years, updated in pencil as he learned new details, and showed her the approaches to the property. There were 3 practical routes to the cabin. The main trail Dennison had used was the most obvious and the most exposed. Anyone coming up that way could be seen from the cabin's eastern window for nearly a quarter mile. The North Ridge approach was faster, but required knowing a specific creek crossing. Strangers attempting it in the dark would likely end up in the wrong drainage entirely. The third route came through the southern tree line and was the one Elias considered most dangerous, because it delivered anyone who used it to within 50 yards of the cabin before they were visible. "If Crow has good scouts, and by everything Hattie said he does, they'll have found all 3, Clara said. "Probably." He put his finger on the southern approach. "This one worries me most. I've got no good sight line until they're already close." "Can you create one?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Clear some of the brush, not all of it. That would tell them you'd done it deliberately, just enough to open a view angle from—" She studied the map, orienting herself from what she knew of the actual terrain, from that rock shelf above the garden. "If you're watching from there, you'd see movement in the tree line maybe 2 minutes earlier than you would from the cabin." He was quiet, looking at the map. 2 minutes is not nothing, she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at the map a moment longer. "I'd need to do it before first light so it doesn't look fresh." "Then we should do it now." They did it now. She held the lantern at the lowest useful setting while he worked, her eyes moving between the tree line and the darkness beyond it, and she understood clearly that this was not a theoretical exercise anymore. Somewhere below this mountain, 7 armed men were preparing to make a decision, and the decision they made would arrive at this property whether she was ready for it or not. Ready or not was something she had been thinking about for most of her life. She chose ready. They were back inside before the gray pre-dawn started at the horizon. Elias made coffee, the first time he had made it rather than her, which was not something she registered consciously at the time but would remember later, and they sat at the table with the map between them and worked through what they knew. Holt and his 3 men were 2 days out, maybe less. Crow's scouts had been spotted yesterday morning heading deeper into the mountain range. If the scouts had reached the cabin location, which was possible, even likely, given the territory, then Crow had the information he needed to make his move. His most logical play was to arrive in force before Holt arrived in force, which meant today or tomorrow at the absolute latest. "What does he want?" Clara asked. "Specifically. Not just a guide. What does he actually want?" Elias wrapped both hands around his cup. "He's looking for a way through the northern pass. The Brennan crossing where his men were spotted is the low route. It's fast but visible, and Holt knows it's the natural line of travel. The pass through the upper Grantham is slower, but it comes out 40 miles north of where anyone's looking." He paused. "There's no good trail through the upper pass. You need someone who knows it by memory, who knows which ledges hold and which ones don't, who knows the stream crossings in spring melt. Someone like you." "Someone like me." She looked at the map. "And if you refuse?" He didn't answer right away. Men like Silas Crow didn't get where they are by accepting refusals. The implication was plain enough. She didn't push it. "Could you give them bad directions?" she asked. "Send them up a route that looks viable but isn't? Something that loses them in the range long enough for Holt to catch up?" He looked at her with an expression she had seen only a few times, the one that meant she'd said something he hadn't thought of and was now thinking of rapidly. It would have to be convincing. A man who used to be a military scout isn't going to walk into an obvious trap. "Then it has to look like you're cooperating, like you're afraid of them and giving them what they want." She leaned forward slightly. "Which means the route has to be real enough that he believes it. Wrong only in the details that matter, details he can't check until he's already committed to the path." Elias set his cup down. "The northern couloir," he said slowly. "It looks like a pass. Runs between the 2 main peaks. In summer it goes through. In late spring, with the melt running, the last quarter-mile floods. Not dangerously, just impassably. They'd have to turn back." He calculated something internal. "It would cost them 6 hours. Maybe 8. Is 8 hours enough time for Holt?" "If Holt is already moving, yes." Clara sat back. "Then that's the option." "That's the option if everything goes correctly. If Crow is as good as they say, he might sense the misdirection before he commits." "He might." She looked at him steadily. "But he's going to underestimate you, because that's what men like him do with people they think they've already beaten. He doesn't know me. He knows you're 1 man alone in the mountains. He has 7. In his experience, that's an equation with 1 answer." She paused. "Let him keep thinking that." They came at mid-morning. Clara saw them first. She was on the rock shelf above the garden, ostensibly checking the early plantings, actually watching the southern tree line, and she saw movement among the trees a full 2 minutes before they cleared the edge, which was exactly as long as she and Elias had calculated. She did not run. Running would tell them she'd seen them. She stood slowly, gathered her tools with the unhurried movements of someone finishing a task, and walked back toward the cabin. She knocked twice on the doorframe as she entered, their signal. She heard Elias move inside the cabin. There were 6 of them that came across the yard, not 7, 1 man presumably posted at the main trail as a watch. They were a hard-looking group, trail-worn and deliberate, in the way that men are deliberate when they've learned that carelessness is expensive. They were armed in the visible way that was designed to make the point before any word was said. Leading them was Silas Crow. She had formed a picture of him from Hattie's description and the newspaper account, and the man walking across her yard matched and didn't match it in equal measure. He was not a large man, middle height, lean, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from being calm, but from having learned to contain something that wasn't calm at all. His face was angular, weathered to a color that put him somewhere between 40 and 55 without being specific about it. He wore his hair cut short under a dark hat, and his eyes moved across the property with the systematic efficiency of a man cataloging what he saw and filing it immediately. Those eyes landed on Clara first. He looked at her the way she had been looked at 1,000 times, the quick assessment, the category assignment, and she watched the category slot into place in his expression. Unthreatening, manageable, already dismissed. She kept her face neutral and held her garden tools and waited. Elias came out of the cabin door behind her. "Boone." Crow's voice was even. Not aggressive. Not yet. The aggression was there but leashed, which told her he was a man who understood that a loose dog was less useful than a controlled one. "Don't know you," Elias said. He stopped 2 steps from the door, which Clara understood was a deliberate position, close enough to the cabin to reach the rifle, far enough from Crow to read the full group. "Name's Crow, Silas Crow." He let the name sit there, waiting to see if it produced something. "I've heard it," Elias said. If it produced anything in him, he did not show it. "What do you want?" "Just a conversation, between reasonable men." Crow's eyes moved across the property again, the cabin, the woodpile, the root cellar entrance, the positions of his own men, and came back to Elias. "I hear you know these mountains better than anyone." "I know them. I need to move my men through to the northern valley, quickly and without using the low road." He said it plainly, which she suspected was his version of courtesy, being direct rather than pretending this was something other than what it was. "I'm told there's a high pass that goes through." "There is." "And you know it." "I do." Crow let a pause sit between them. Not uncomfortable, a deliberate pause, the pause of a man deciding which tool to use. "I'd make it worth your while." "How worth my while?" The number Crow named was significant. Clara didn't react to it, and she could see from her peripheral vision that Elias didn't either, not visibly. But it was a number that told her Crow had resources and was not particularly concerned about spending them. "Let me think about it," Elias said. Crow's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a degree of compression at the corners of his eyes that told her he was recalibrating. He had expected immediate compliance or immediate refusal, and the moderate response had put him in a gap he hadn't prepared for. "I don't have a long window for thinking." "Then I won't take long." Elias looked at the sky. "An hour." Crow studied him for a moment, then he nodded, once. "1 hour, Boone. My men will stay here in your yard while we wait. I trust that's agreeable." It was not a question. "It's agreeable," Elias said. Inside the cabin, with the door shut, Elias looked at Clara with an expression she could not read at first. It took her a moment to identify it because she hadn't seen it on him before. He was frightened, not for himself. "You should stay inside," he said quietly. "Stay inside and stay away from the windows." "That's not the plan we discussed." "The plan we discussed did not account for—" He stopped, looked at the door. Outside, she could hear the low sounds of men settling into waiting, the clink of a bit, a voice saying something to someone else, a short, rough laugh. "There are 6 of them in the yard, Clara. 1 more watching the trail. If this goes wrong, it's not going to go wrong." "You can't know that." "No, I can't know that." She looked at him steadily. "I also can't know that staying inside keeps me safe if things go bad. If they decide to take you and burn the property, inside is the worst place to be." She kept her voice low, calm. "The plan is good. You know that pass. You know it floods. You send them up the couloir with enough confidence that Crow believes it, and we buy Holt 8 hours. And if Crow has been through mountain passes that flood before, and he knows what it looks like going in, then we need something else." She thought fast. "When you give him the route, give him something real first. Some true detail about the early section of the trail that he can verify from his scouts. Something that makes the rest of the information feel equally credible." Elias thought. "The first 2 miles are real enough. The creek crossing at the 3rd mile is genuine. It's crossable this time of year, just difficult." "That's true. That's checkable." "Tell him about it. The specific crossing, how deep it runs, where the best footing is. Details like that from a man who's crossed it 100 times. Then the route compounds on that truth and he doesn't question the end of it because the beginning held up." He was looking at her in a way she recognized now, the look he'd given her over the garden rows, over the reorganized root cellar, over the idea of clearing the brush above the garden. The look of someone recalculating a value upward. She didn't wait for the look to finish. "Go back out there," she said. "I'll watch from the east window. If any of them move toward the cache, they won't find it. If they move toward it, I'll make noise in the kitchen, loud enough to redirect attention." She paused. "Go." Her hour is going to feel very short from his side of it. He went. She watched from the east window, standing well back from the glass the way Elias had shown her, so that anyone looking at the cabin from outside would see no face in the frame. Crow had positioned his men with the casual precision of someone who does this without thinking about it. 1 at the main trail entrance to the yard, 1 near the woodpile, two at a relaxed position near the center where they had sight lines across the whole property, and one who had drifted toward the eastern edge of the garden, close enough to the rock shelf that Clara's stomach tightened. But he stopped there and lit a cigarette and simply looked at the mountains, which was either genuine disinterest or very good performance. She couldn't tell which, and decided to assume performance. Elias walked across the yard to where Crow stood apart from the others. She could not hear what was said from inside the cabin. She watched body language instead. Elias stood with his arms loose at his sides, not crossed, not in his pockets, rather than being free of it, which was exactly what a man in this situation ought to look like. Crow stood with his weight slightly back, listening. She saw Elias gesture northward, up and to the left, toward the couloir. She saw Crow look in that direction, look back, say something. Elias responded. More gesture, both hands this time, approximating the shape of a trail, a crossing, the incline of a slope. He was giving the details she had suggested. She could tell from the quality of Crow's attention that he was following carefully, processing each piece of information against his own knowledge of mountain terrain. This was the dangerous part, not the agreement but the credibility of it. She held her breath without deciding to. Then Crow nodded. One nod, not two, not full enthusiasm, but acceptance. The acceptance of a man who was keeping his own counsel about final judgment but was satisfied enough to proceed. She breathed out. The gang left within 20 minutes of that nod, moving north through the yard with the organized efficiency of a military unit, which reminded her that their leader had been exactly that once. Crow paused at the edge of the property and looked back at the cabin, just once, just briefly. She could not see his expression from this distance. Then they were gone into the tree line. Elias came inside. He sat down at the table. He sat there for what felt like a long time, his hands flat on the wood, his breathing even, and she understood that this was the cost of it, the cost of performing calm for 60 minutes in front of a dangerous man who was fully capable of reading deception. She did not speak. She got him water from the pitcher and set it in front of him and sat down across from him. He drank. He bought it, he said. Flat. Still running through it. I saw the nod. He's good. He asked 3 things that could have been traps, questions about specific landmarks that he might know from his scouts. I answered 2 correctly and told him I wasn't certain about the 3rd one. He paused. If I'd answered all 3 with full confidence, he'd have known something was wrong. Real knowledge has gaps in it. She looked at him. You thought of that on your own, while standing in front of him. It occurred to me. He looked at the door. They'll reach the couloir approach by mid-afternoon. The flood section is another 3 hours beyond that. They'll know they're stuck by evening, then they turn back. He calculated. Depending on how Crow reads the situation, whether he thinks the flooding was natural or deliberate, we'll either get 8 quiet hours or he'll come back here tonight. The possibility had not escaped her. What's the read? Your read on him. Does he suspect? Elias considered it carefully. He suspects that I was more willing to cooperate than a man would naturally be. He noticed that. He paused. But he also knows he has 7 armed men, and I have no practical option but cooperation. He could explain my compliance that way and feel comfortable with it. So it's even odds. More or less. He looked at her. I need to get word to Holt, not just the original message through Hattie, direct word, with the route Crow is taking and the time they left. If Holt moves fast, he can position men at the couloir exit before Crow turns back. Hattie's a day away from here at best. I know. I'll have to ride myself. He was already working through it. 2 hours down to the Drummond place. Hattie's husband can relay the message faster than I can reach Holt directly. He knows the lower trail. Clara did the arithmetic. 2 hours down, time for the relay. 2 hours back. If Crow came back tonight, I'll be here alone, she said. I know. He looked at her, and in his face she saw the conflict of it, the competing necessities pulling in opposite directions, and his clear discomfort with the one that left her here without him. I can't see another way. There isn't one. She said it before he finished. Go, I have the rifle. Have you ever... My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. He believed women in frontier territory needed to know how. She met his eyes. I'm not going to pretend I'm practiced, but I'm not helpless. He studied her face with the same attention he gave everything that mattered. The rifle is loaded, he said. There are rounds in the box on the shelf above it. If anyone comes, don't go outside. The cabin gives you more protection than the yard. I know. And Clara, he stopped, started again. If it's more than 2 men and they're determined, don't try to hold the cabin. Go out the back, take the North Ridge Trail, get to the Drummond place. And leave this behind? The cabin can be rebuilt. His voice was very direct. You can't be. She held that sentence for a moment. Let it sit where it landed. I'll be careful, she said. Go. I was gone by noon. The cabin was more silent without him than it had been in all the weeks before he became the fixed point she oriented around. She had not noticed how much of the mountain's voice she heard through him, through his reactions to sounds, his stillness when something was nothing, the small adjustments he made to his posture when something was worth noting. Without him, she had to do all that reading herself, from scratch, using skills she was still developing. She was not going to be frightened. Fear was a reasonable response to the situation, and she allowed it to exist in a small compartment in her chest where it could inform her without controlling her. That was the best she could do. She moved through the cabin with purpose. She rechecked the shutters. She counted the rounds on the shelf, 14, plus the rifle was loaded, plus the small revolver her father's knife had always seemed like the companion to, and which she had found, to her genuine surprise, in the bottom of the root cellar supplies Elias had shown her. She hadn't asked about the revolver. She just cleaned it the way her father had taught her, checked the cylinder, and put it in the pocket of her apron. She made bread. Not because she was hungry or because the timing was sensible, but because making bread required both hands and a sequence of tasks that organized the mind. She kneaded the dough with methodical pressure, watching the east window, watching the south tree line through the kitchen window, watching the main trail through the gap in the front shutter. The afternoon moved slowly. Nothing came. By 3 o'clock, she began to think, cautiously, that the couloir plan had worked exactly as intended, that Crow's men were 3 miles up the northern approach, beginning the last section before the flood section stopped them, and that the turnback decision was still hours away. She began to think that the evening would be quiet, and Elias would return by dark, and that tomorrow would bring Holt with his men and the territorial weight of the law. That was when she heard the horse. One horse, not many, moving up the main trail from below at a pace that was too urgent to be casual. She crossed to the east window and looked out. One rider, coming fast. Not Crow's men. They had gone north on foot, leaving their horses below the lower trail. Not Holt. Too soon. Too few men. The rider came into the yard at a hard trot, and she recognized the shape of the spotted mule before she recognized the woman on it. Hattie. She was out the door before Hattie had finished dismounting, and what she saw in the older woman's face set the compartment in her chest rattling. They split, Hattie said, breathing hard. Crow split his group. My husband saw it from the eastern ridge. The main group went north like you expected, but Crow held back 2 men. They went around. She looked at Clara with steady eyes. The long way. South approach. Clara's mind ran the calculation instantly. South approach. The approach that added time but came around the couloir entirely. The approach that bypassed everything they'd set up in the north. Crow had suspected. He'd sent the bulk of his men up the false route, either as genuine test of the information or as deliberate decoy, and kept 2 men back to hit the cabin from the south while Elias was gone. 2 men. 2 armed men who would arrive by— How long? She asked. My husband saw them break away an hour ago. South approach from their position is— Hattie was calculating. 2 hours, maybe less, depending how well they know the trail. An hour, maybe less. Clara looked at Hattie. Can you get Elias? I came from the other direction. I'd have to ride back to my husband and he'd have to intercept. Hattie's face told her the timing before the words did. Not enough. Elias was 2 hours down the mountain in one direction. The men were 1 hour up the mountain from the other direction. Holt was 2 days away. Hattie was here, and there were 2 horses, the spotted mule and Elias's saddle horse that he'd left behind when he went on foot to make better time on the lower switchbacks. And Clara was here. She looked at the cabin. She thought about what Elias had told her. The cabin gives you more protection than the yard. She thought about the 14 rounds on the shelf and the revolver in her apron pocket, and the 2 minutes of advance warning the rock shelf above the garden would give her from the south approach. She thought about everything she had been told her whole life about what she was and wasn't capable of. She thought about her father, who had believed that women in frontier territory needed to know how to defend themselves. Not because the world was fair, but because the world was exactly what it was. She turned to Hattie. "Ride back down and intercept Elias," she said. "Tell him south approach, 2 men, 1 hour lead." Hattie looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who has lived outdoors most of her life and learned to read situations quickly. "And you?" "I'll be here." Clara said it with the certainty she was deciding into rather than feeling, which was, she had come to understand, the only way certainty ever actually worked. "I know the sight lines. I know the cabin. I know the approaches." She paused. "And they don't know me." Hattie held her eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once, the compact nod of a woman who respects a decision even when it frightens her. She got back on the mule. "Don't let them get between you and the back door," she said, "if it comes to that." "I won't." The mule turned and went back down the trail at speed. Clara went inside. She took the rifle down from the pegs. She stood in the empty cabin for a moment, holding it, feeling its weight the way she had felt her father's folding knife the morning Margaret counted out those coins. Familiar, specific, the particular gravity of a thing that meant something. Then she moved to the east window, positioned herself where she could see the south tree line through the gap, and waited. The mountain had its own conversation going, the same conversation it always had. Wind and birds and the deep structural sounds underneath. It did not care that she was alone. It did not adjust itself to the situation. Neither did she. The minutes moved. The tree line was still. She breathed in the way her father had taught her, way back before everything changed, slow and even, in through the nose, because a held breath makes a shaking hand and a shaking hand makes a poor shot. She breathed and watched the southern trees and waited. The first man came out of the tree line 37 minutes later. He came carefully, which told her he was experienced, crouching slightly, using the brush at the tree line edge as cover, scanning the cabin and the yard before committing to open ground. He had a rifle across his body and a revolver at his hip, and he moved the way men move when they expect resistance but are not certain where it will come from. He had not looked at the rock shelf above the garden. Clara had been watching him from the rock shelf above the garden for the past 20 minutes, having moved there when the weight told her to move. When the stillness of staying in one place had started to feel more like hiding than preparation. She let him take 3 steps into the yard. "Stop where you are," she said, loud and level. He stopped. He turned, slow, scanning for the source. Because that was the thing about the rock shelf. It was above the natural sight line, and a man expecting threat from ground level did not immediately find a voice coming from above. She was in position behind the largest rock, the rifle resting on its surface, her breathing even. She could see him clearly. He could not see her with any precision, only the general direction. "There's a rifle pointed at your chest," she said. "Tell your partner to come out of the trees." A pause. He was calculating. Where she was, whether she was alone, whether the voice matched someone capable of backing the threat. He was underestimating her, or she could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he was already beginning to assess angles rather than comply. "I won't say it again," she said. The second man came out of the tree line 10 feet to the left of the first, which told her they'd communicated without words, a hand signal she hadn't seen, or a pattern established in advance. He came out with his own rifle raised, which was worse, but he was also looking at the wrong angle from the first man, which meant their coverage of her position was incomplete. She fired. Not at either man, into the ground 6 feet in front of them, because she was not a killer, and this was not a killing situation yet. And because a shot that close to a man's feet, from a position he can't precisely locate, tells him something very specific about the person holding the rifle. It tells him she knows what she's doing. Both men stopped. "I have 14 rounds," she said, loading the next shot with practiced hands, loud enough for them to hear the sound of it. "We can talk or we can do this the other way. It's your choice." She kept her breathing even. She kept the rifle level. And she waited for them to make the decision that was in the end the only reasonable one. The first man lowered his rifle slowly. He did it with the particular slowness of someone who had made calculations and arrived at a result he didn't like but could not argue with. The second man followed, 3 seconds later, which was 3 seconds of her life that she would never fully account for. 3 seconds of pure suspended outcome, of everything that could happen, balanced against everything that she needed to happen. And then they both stood in the yard with their rifles lowered, and Clara Whitmore stayed behind her rock with her breathing even and her hands steady and the afternoon light cutting long and golden across the mountains that had become, in 8 weeks and against every expectation, the first place in her adult life that she would fight for. She heard the horses before she saw them, coming up the main trail fast, too fast for easy riding, and she knew that sound by now too, the rhythm of that dark bay. Elias came into the yard at a run, Hattie's spotted mule right behind him, and he took in the scene in a single sweep. 2 men standing in the open with their rifles down, Clara on the rock shelf above the garden, and his face did something she saw even from 50 yards away. He pulled up. He looked at the 2 men. He looked at her. She stood slowly from behind the rock and held the rifle at her side. He sat on his horse for a moment without moving. Then he dismounted, and his movements as he crossed the yard toward the 2 men were different from the controlled performance she had watched him give Crow. This was something else, something with more temperature in it, though his voice when he spoke to the men was entirely even. "Hands up," he said. "Both of them." They complied. She walked down from the rock shelf carefully, watching her footing, and crossed the yard. Up close she could see the particular quality of Elias's stillness now. It was not the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of something large and forceful contained behind a thin wall of deliberate control. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle in her hand. He looked at her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." "Are you—" He stopped. The question shifted underneath him. "Are you all right?" She thought about what that question actually meant, given the last 40 minutes of her life, and she answered it honestly. "Not entirely," she said, "but I will be." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked away, back at the 2 men, because there was still work that needed doing, securing these men, signaling Holt, accounting for the rest of Crow's group in the northern couloir. And Elias Boone was a man who did not stop doing the work simply because something had moved him. But she had seen his face. In all the weeks since she arrived on this mountain, through bread making and garden planting and stone signals and late evenings on the porch, and the long quiet of 2 people learning to share a silence without filling it with noise. In all of that, she had never seen his face look quite the way it looked in the moment he understood what she had done alone in this yard while he was riding back to her. She cataloged it, stored it in the same place she stored the good things she'd been saving up against the cold. Then she went inside to put the rifle back on its pegs, because Holt was coming and there was supper to start, and the mountain was already running through its evening conversation as though nothing particularly extraordinary had happened here at all. Deputy Holt arrived the following afternoon with 3 men and a pack mule carrying enough rope and iron restraints to suggest he had been expecting a larger catch than he found. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with a dark mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had learned that the first version of any story he was told was rarely the complete one. He rode into the yard, took in the cabin, the 2 secured men tied to the hitching post, the woman standing in the doorway with a flour sack apron, and Elias Boone leaning against the fence with his arms crossed, and he spent a long moment arranging what he saw against what he had expected. "Boone," he said. "Holt. I got your message." He dismounted and handed his reins to one of his men without looking away from Elias. "Got it about 4 hours after I got a second message from a Mrs. Drummond, who rides faster than she should at her age." He looked at the 2 tied men. "Crows?" "2 of them. The rest went north up the couloir route. Should be turning back about now if the melt is running like it was yesterday." Holt looked at him steadily. "You sent Silas Crow up a flooded pass." "I gave him directions to a pass. The flooding is a natural condition of the season." Elias's voice was even. "I didn't tell him it wasn't flooded." "That's a careful distinction." "It's an accurate one." Holt looked at the 2 secured men, then at Clara in the doorway, then back at Elias. "Who took these 2? A pause. "I did," Clara said. Holt turned to look at her fully for the first time. He looked at her the way men sometimes look when they are revising something, an expectation meeting a reality, and the gap between them requiring acknowledgement. "You," he said. "They came up the south approach while Elias was riding to send you word. I had a rifle in a good position." She kept her voice matter-of-fact. "They chose to cooperate." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "All right then," and began moving toward the tied men with the professional focus of someone who had a job to do and intended to do it. They spent the next 2 days on the mountain, Holt and his men, which was not what Clara had anticipated, but which turned out to be a necessary rather than voluntary arrangement. Crow's main group came back off the couloir the evening of the first day, cold, furious, and arriving at the lower trailhead directly into the arms of two of Holt's men who had been positioned there exactly for that purpose. That left Crow himself unaccounted for until the morning of the second day, when he walked out of the eastern tree line alone, on foot, without his horse, and presented himself at the cabin yard with the particular bearing of a man who has calculated his options and determined that all of them are bad. He stood in the yard and looked at Elias. "The pass flooded," he said. "Spring melt," Elias said. "I did mention the crossing was difficult." Something moved through Crow's expression. Not admiration exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone who has been outplayed and is honest enough with himself to know it. "The two men I sent south. Holt has them." Crow nodded slowly. He looked at Clara then, standing near the cabin door, and this time his look was different from the first time he'd assessed her. The category he had assigned her was gone. He looked at her like a person, reconsidering. "You," he said. She said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. Then he looked back at Elias. "I want to be straight with you, Boone. I don't hold a grudge for good strategy. That's generous of you," Elias said, and meant none of it. "I'm going to make this simple." Holt came around the corner of the cabin with his hand on his holster. "Silas Crow, you're under arrest by authority of the Wyoming Territorial Judiciary for armed robbery, assault, and a number of additional charges I'll enumerate when we're somewhere with paper." He stopped a few feet from Crow and looked at him without drama. "You going to make this difficult?" Crow looked at him, looked at the cabin, looked at Elias, at Clara, at the mountains behind them. "No," he said, "I'm not." And that was how Silas Crow ended, not in a blaze of final defiance or a dramatic last stand. He stood in a mountain yard on a cool morning and put his hands out for the irons with the tired resignation of a man who had run a long way and understood, finally, that the running was done. Clara watched from the doorway and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent. The particular feeling of a thing that has been unresolved and dangerous, resolving itself into something clear and definite, even if the clarity was not pleasant. Holt spent most of that second day asking questions, which was his right and his job, and Elias answered them with the same careful accuracy he had applied to everything else. Complete where completeness served the truth, spare where sparseness was honest. Clara was questioned separately, which she had not anticipated. Holt sat across from her at the rough table and had his youngest deputy take notes while he asked her about the two men she had held at rifle point in the yard. It was thorough. He asked about the shot she had fired, where it had landed, what she had said, how they had responded, how long she had held the position before Elias returned. He asked without skepticism, but also without the softening that people sometimes applied when they thought a woman might need protection from the plain shape of what had happened. She appreciated that. She answered plainly. When they were finished, he looked at his notes and then at her. "You understand that what you did was—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Significant. 2 armed men. I understand that. Most people, most men I've encountered in this work, would have done differently." He paused. "Hidden, run, waited. Hiding and running would have left the cabin undefended and given them time to search the property. Running might have taken me into their field of view before I reached cover." She said it simply, because it was simply how she had thought through it at the time. "It was better to hold the position." Holt studied her. "You'd thought that through." "Elias and I had prepared, not for that exact situation, but for something like it. The preparation meant I wasn't thinking from scratch when it happened." He nodded slowly, put his pen down. "Mrs. Boone." The title landed oddly, not wrong, but new. She had not thought of herself by that name yet, or perhaps had thought of it only as a legal technicality, a term of the arrangement that had been transacted over a kitchen table in Silver Creek. Hearing it from Holt, in the context of what she had done in this yard, made it feel like something different, something with more weight to it. "Yes," she said. "You did well." He said it plainly, the way he said everything. "This territory is better off for what you and your husband did these past 2 days. I intend to say so in my report." She thought of Margaret counting coins. She thought of Mrs. Calloway pressing her lips together at the side of the road. She thought of 19 years of the particular arithmetic that had been applied to her, the constant calculation of what she was worth, always arriving at the same insufficient answer. She did not say any of that. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for different reasons than Holt could know. After Holt's party left, taking Crow, his men, the pack mule, and several days' worth of the mountain's accumulated tension with them, the cabin settled back into its own rhythms with the somewhat dazed quality of a house that has been a different kind of place for a few days and is remembering what it normally is. Clara stood in the yard the evening after they left and looked at the spot where Crow had stood with his hands out for the irons, and then she looked at the rock shelf above the garden, and then at the south tree line where the two men had emerged, and she felt the events of the past days moving through her the way strong weather moves through, present and overwhelming while it's happening and then gone, and the landscape afterward both the same and permanently altered. Elias came and stood beside her. He did not say anything right away, which was his nature, and she had stopped needing him to fill silence. "Your name's going to be in Holt's report," he said eventually. "So he said. People will hear about it down in Silver Creek eventually. Hattie talks and Hattie's husband talks, and the story will move down the mountain the way stories do." She thought about Silver Creek, about the road she had walked down with a flour sack and eyes on her back, about Mrs. Calloway and her pressed lips, and her particular brand of pity that was mostly contempt with a polite coat on it. "Let it," she said. He looked at her. "You're not bothered by it?" "I used to be bothered by what Silver Creek thought of me. Deeply bothered. Spent years trying to be smaller and quieter so they'd find me less—" she looked for the word— "less of an inconvenience. And now?" She looked at the tree line. The late light was the particular gold of late afternoons up here, the kind that made everything look like it had been chosen deliberately. "Now I have a rock shelf with a good sight line and 14 rounds, and I'm not particularly interested in what people who've never held a position find polite to think." He was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. It was the first time he had said the name directly to her, the first time he had introduced his wife into a conversation, rather than having Clara arrive at the subject sideways. She understood the weight of it and did not treat it lightly. "Tell me about her," she said. She felt him hesitate, the brief moment of resistance that came from years of keeping that particular room closed. She was— He stopped, started differently. She had opinions about everything, loudly. She thought the natural history books were more interesting than the novels, and she was probably right, but she would have argued the point even if she wasn't. He paused. "She could make a meal out of whatever was in the root cellar and make it good, which is a skill I don't have. She talked to the horses like they were people, which they mostly ignored, but she kept doing it." Another pause. Longer. She would have reorganized the root cellar the same week she arrived. Clara let that sit. "I'm sorry you lost her," she said. "I know." He said it simply, not performing grief, not managing it, just stating a fact about himself that he had learned to live next to even when it was heavy. She'd been sick before, small things, nothing that lasted. The fever came different, faster. I didn't understand at first how different it was. She did not offer the things people usually offered. She had been on the receiving end of those things enough times to know that most of them were for the comfort of the person saying them rather than the person hearing them. "You stayed," she said instead. "This was our place." He looked at the mountains. "It still is. It's both things. It's where she's gone, and it's where I still am, and those two things have been living in the same space for 7 years, and I've been—" He stopped, trying to make them fit together without losing either one. She thought about her father's folding knife. She thought about the watch that Margaret had kept for compensation. She thought about the way certain losses don't diminish so much as find a different kind of accommodation in you, the way you don't stop carrying them, but eventually learn to carry them without them being the only thing you carry. "You don't have to lose her to make room," she said. "That's not how it works." He looked at her. "People who are gone don't take up space the same way living people do," she said. "Eleanor gets to stay exactly where she is. The books are still hers. The name in the cover is still hers." She paused. "That doesn't have to change." I was quiet for a long time. The evening birds made their count. The light shifted the way it always shifted. "You're different from what I expected," he said. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. Something smaller. He said it like he was working out the right word as he went. Not in size, in scope. She considered that. I've been told to be smaller my whole life. Apparently, I'm not very good at it. The corner of his mouth moved, the thing that wasn't quite a smile but lived close to it. No, he said. You're not. 3 weeks after Holt left the mountain, Clara made a decision. She had been turning it over for some time, not anxiously, but the way you turn over something real, something with actual weight and actual consequences, because it deserved that kind of attention. And when she finally decided, she told Elias at the breakfast table directly, the way she had learned he preferred things. I want to go down to Silver Creek. He looked up from his coffee. Not to stay, she said. Not to go back. I want to go down and… She thought about how to say it accurately. I have some things I left unfinished, not things I can do from up here. What kind of things? Margaret has my father's watch. She said it plainly. I want it back. Not because I need it, but because it's mine and I'd like it, and I've spent enough time telling myself that I don't deserve the things that belong to me. She looked at her cup. And I want to stand in that town as myself. Not the girl they sold off, myself. He was quiet. I'll go with you if you want, he said, or I'll stay here if you'd rather do it alone. She had thought about that too. Come with me, she said, not to fight my battles. Just come with me. All right. They rode down 3 days later, on a morning that was finally genuinely spring, the kind of spring morning that the mountains produced like something earned, warm and clear, with the smell of thawed ground and pine in the air. The trail she had ridden up in a wagon with everything she owned in a flour sack looked different going down. Not smaller exactly, the mountains didn't shrink, but less overwhelming. More like terrain she knew than terrain she was being delivered into. Silver Creek was a 2-day ride with a night camp, and they made the camp in comfortable near silence, each doing their portion of the work without discussion. The coordination of 2 people who had lived alongside each other long enough that the logistics had become automatic. She thought, lying in her bedroll looking at the stars through the pines, that this was another thing she had not known to want before she had it. The particular companionship of someone whose silence was not hostile, whose presence was not a transaction, who was simply there in the way that people are simply there when they have decided you are worth being there for. She slept well. Silver Creek looked smaller than she remembered. This was a common experience, she understood, leaving a place and returning to find it scaled down by the distance you'd traveled. But it was still startling. The main road, which had felt enormous on the morning she walked down it with a flour sack and a town watching her, was a perfectly ordinary road. The buildings were the size buildings were. Mrs. Calloway's house, which had loomed in memory, sat modest and unremarkable between 2 others exactly like it. Elias rode beside her without comment. She felt the eyes. Silver Creek was a small town, and strangers, or people who had been gone long enough to become strangers, were noticed. She saw 2 women on the dry goods store porch stop their conversation as she and Elias passed. She saw the saloon's day man pause in his sweeping. She kept her spine straight and her eyes forward and did not hurry. Margaret Whitmore's house was at the end of the second road, set back from the street with a kitchen garden that Clara had maintained for 3 years, which was now somewhat overgrown. She knocked. Margaret opened the door and went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: recognition, surprise, and then a rearrangement that settled into something careful and assessing. She looked at Clara. She looked at Elias behind her. She looked at Clara again. You look… Margaret stopped. Different, Clara supplied. I imagine I do. She looked at her stepmother steadily. There was no hatred in it. She had been afraid on the ride down that she would arrive here full of something hot and difficult to manage. What she actually felt was something cooler and more permanent. I came for my father's watch. I wrote to you about that. You did. I've come to give you the opportunity to reconsider the position you laid out in that letter. Margaret's jaw set. That watch was fair compensation for… It wasn't, Clara said. Not angry, simply clear. You know it wasn't. My father left you this house and whatever was in it. He didn't leave you his family's things. He didn't leave you me either, but that's a different matter. She looked at her stepmother without blinking. I'm not here to cause trouble. I don't want trouble. I want my father's watch, and then I'll leave you to whatever you've arranged for your life here. A silence. Elias stood behind her, quiet, his hat in his hands. Not intervening, just present. She could feel his presence the way you can feel warmth from a fire across a room, which was exactly what she had asked of him and exactly what he was providing. Margaret looked at him again. Something shifted in her assessment. He was not what she had imagined. Clara could read that much. Whatever Margaret had been told about the mountain man she'd sold a girl to, the man standing in her doorway did not confirm it. "Wait here," Margaret said finally. She went inside. She was gone for less than 3 minutes. She came back with the watch. It was smaller than Clara's memory of it. The memories of childhood always are. A silver case with a small dent on the left side that had been there since before she was born, inherited from her grandfather's own travels. She opened the case, and the face was exactly as she remembered, the small hand moving its quiet circle. She closed it. She put it in her pocket. "Thank you," she said to Margaret. She meant it in the plain sense. A transaction had been completed. An acknowledgement was appropriate. Nothing more complicated than that. She turned and walked away from her stepmother's house with Elias beside her, and she did not look back. And this time, the not looking back cost her nothing at all. They stayed in Silver Creek one night, at the boarding house on the main road, because the return ride was 2 days, and Elias needed to arrange for some supplies he'd been planning to order from the hardware merchant. Clara walked the town while he was occupied, not hiding, not performing, just walking. She stopped at the dry goods store for a spool of thread she actually needed. Mrs. Calloway was inside. The woman went through the same rapid sequence that Margaret had: recognition, surprise, recalibration. But where Margaret had gone careful, Mrs. Calloway went somewhere else. She had the look of a person confronting new information that doesn't fit the framework they've been using and is not yet sure which to revise. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Clara Boone," Clara said, not correcting her for the pleasure of it, just accurate. "I'm in to pick up thread." Mrs. Calloway looked at her. In the years of Clara's life in this town, that look had always contained a specific quality, the pity-edged assessment, the look of a woman who has concluded that certain other women are unfortunate facts of life and treats them as such. Today it contained something different, uncertainty, mostly. "I heard," Mrs. Calloway started, "there was talk that you had helped that there was some trouble in the mountains with outlaws." "There was some trouble. It's been resolved." "You were involved in that." "I was." The woman's face worked through something. "Alone," they said. "Holt's in a better position to describe the facts of it than I am. His report would have the details." Clara found the thread she needed, brought it to the counter, placed her coin beside it. "Is there anything else?" Mrs. Calloway opened her mouth and then closed it again, the movement of a woman who has prepared a sentence and discovered mid-delivery that it no longer fits the situation. She took the coin and gave the change without meeting Clara's eyes. Clara picked up her thread. "Good day, Mrs. Calloway," she said, and meant it entirely without cruelty. She walked out into the bright spring street feeling something she could not immediately name. Not triumph, because triumph implied a contest she had wanted to win, and she had not wanted to win anything here. Something quieter. The feeling of a woman who has been measured by a town's expectations her whole life and has discovered, finally, that those expectations have no power unless you hand it to them. She had stopped handing it. The ride back up the mountain took 2 days and felt like returning rather than arriving, which was a distinction she had not been capable of feeling on the first trip and felt clearly now. She carried her father's watch in her breast pocket for the whole ride, aware of its weight against her chest. Not heavy, but present. Specific. The particular weight of something recovered. On the second day, coming up through the lower foothills into the genuine mountain terrain she knew now by its shapes and its sounds, Elias said, from his horse beside her. "You didn't need me there." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "In Silver Creek. You didn't need me there." Not accusatory, just observational, the way he said everything that mattered. "You would have gotten the watch on your own. You would have walked that street on your own." She thought about it honestly. "Maybe. Probably." She paused. "But I wanted you there." He looked at the trail ahead. "That's different from needing," he said. "Yes, it is." She paused. "Does that mean something to you?" He was quiet for a moment. In the weeks she had known him, she had learned the varieties of his silence. This was the one where he was not stalling or avoiding, but simply taking the thing seriously, giving it the weight it deserved before responding. "It means something," he said. She did not push for more than that. She had learned that his words, when they came, carried their full meaning without requiring expansion. "It means something" from Elias Boone was not the compressed version of a longer declaration. It was the declaration. They rode the rest of the way up in the comfortable silence that had become, over these weeks, one of the things she valued most about this life she had fallen into sideways. Summer came to the Grantham Range with a particular generosity that Elias told her was not to be trusted, that the mountain could turn in August the way it could turn in February, without warning and without mercy, but which Clara experienced as simply beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when you are present enough to see them properly. The garden came in. Not perfectly. A late cold snap damaged the hedgerows, and she lost half the early lettuce, and spent an afternoon being genuinely irritated about it before replanting, but abundantly enough that she had more than 2 people could use, which led to an idea she had been forming for some time. Hattie Drummond came up with the post every 2 weeks now instead of monthly, partly because there was more post to carry, and partly, Clara suspected, because Hattie found the trips worthwhile for reasons that had nothing to do with delivery. She was one of those people who collected the details of other people's lives the way some people collect useful objects, not to use against them, but simply because connection was the thing she was best at, and she practiced it constantly. "The Henderson family," Clara said one afternoon while she and Hattie sat on the porch with coffee. "The ones Elias left fish for. What about them? They're still in the lower range? Still managing?" "More or less. Mother's health has improved, but the father broke his hand in March, and they lost the spring planting. They'll be thin by fall." Hattie looked at her. "Why?" "Because I have more than I need." She looked at the garden, the root cellar's comfortable fullness, the shelf of preserves she had been putting up for the past month. "And the trail between here and their place is something I can ride now." Hattie looked at her with that particular expression of a woman watching something she has hoped for actually happening. "You're talking about making runs. I'm talking about not having more than I need while someone down the range has less than they need. Those are 2 facts that can be changed." Hattie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There are 3 other families below the Henderson place. 2 of them are also thin. One of them has an injured man and a wife who hasn't had another woman to talk to in 4 months. She paused. "I'm just noting facts." "Noted," Clara said. She started the following week. The first run was awkward in the way that new things are awkward. The logistics of what to bring, how much, whether to announce herself or simply leave things at the trail marker the way Elias had done with the fish. She ended up doing both, leaving a basket at the marker and then continuing to the house itself, because she had thought about it and decided that leaving things without a face attached was a kindness, but it was an anonymous kindness, and what Hattie had said about the wife who hadn't talked to another woman in 4 months suggested that the face might matter as much as the basket. She was right. The woman's name was Dorothea Henderson, and she was 31 years old and had been living in the lower range for 3 years with 2 children and a husband who was good-hearted and limited in equal measure. And she had the slightly hollow look of someone whose world had gotten very small and who was aware of it but didn't know what to do about it. She saw Clara coming and stood in her doorway with an expression that moved through surprise and caution. And then, when Clara set the basket down on the porch and said simply, "I'm Clara Boone, from up the mountain. I've got more root vegetables than we can use this month." Something else entirely. Something that was mostly relief, but the kind of relief that lives close to tears. "Come inside," Dorothea said. "I'll make—" She looked behind her with the quick inventory of a woman checking what she has to offer. "I have coffee. It's thin, but it's hot." "Thin coffee is still coffee," Clara said, and went inside. She stayed 2 hours. She stayed because there was genuine conversation to be had. Dorothea was sharper than her circumstances had allowed her to be recently, and she had opinions about everything from crop rotation to territorial politics, and the pleasure of expressing those opinions to someone who pushed back and engaged rather than simply enduring them was visibly restoring something in her. Clara felt it too. She had Hattie, and she had Elias, and she had the mountain, but there was a specific thing that women talking to women provided that nothing else did, and she had been without it for months. She rode back up the mountain in the early afternoon with an empty basket and the feeling of someone who has discovered a new use for themselves. Elias was at the fence line when she came into the yard, mending a section that had gone soft over the winter. He looked up, assessed her expression, and said, "How were they?" "Thin," she said. "But Dorothea Henderson can talk politics better than anyone I've met in a long time." He almost smiled. "Are you going back?" "In 2 weeks. I told her I would." She dismounted and began untacking the horse. "There are 3 other families below them." He took the saddle from her and moved it to the rail. "The Pruitt family has a sick child," he said. "Youngest one, coughing since February." She looked at him. "You've known this?" "I leave supplies at the marker." "Elias, a coughing child is not the same thing as needing supplies." He looked at the saddle. "I know. I don't." He stopped. "I'm not good at that part. Going to people." She understood that. Understood the years of solitude that had made going to people feel impossible even when the instinct toward care was genuine. "I'll go," she said. "But tell me what you know about them," he told her. But by late summer, Clara had made regular runs to 5 families in the lower range. She brought food when she had surplus, which was most months, because she had learned the mountain's productive seasons and planned accordingly, and she brought company, which cost her nothing and was worth more than the food by at least equal measure. She brought practical knowledge when she had it. The plant medicine books on Elias's shelf became working reference rather than decoration, and she spent evenings reading them with the specific attention of someone learning a skill she intended to use. She set the broken finger of Dorothea's husband in August, following instructions she had read twice carefully before writing down. It was not a clean job, she said so honestly, and he winced appropriately at several points. But it set true, and he was back to full work within the month. Hattie watched all of this with the expression of a woman who has had a theory confirmed. "You know what people are starting to say about you," she told Clara one afternoon. "I can't be responsible for what people say." "No, but you can hear it." Hattie refilled her own cup. "They're saying Boone's wife is worth knowing. They're saying if you've got trouble on the upper range, she's who you go to." She paused. "They're saying it in Silver Creek, too. Word travels." Clara thought about Mrs. Calloway's face in the dry goods store. "Word can do what it likes." "Holt mentioned you in a letter to the territorial office," Hattie continued, in the tone of someone who knows the weight of what they're saying. "By name. Called what you did in the yard, his words, an act of considerable courage for which the territory was in your debt." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I was frightened," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "Of course you were frightened. You'd have been a fool not to be." Hattie looked at her evenly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the thing anyway, and doing it well." Clara thought about the 2 minutes of advance warning from the rock shelf, about her father's voice in her memory, talking about slow, steady breathing, about the particular steadiness that had come from preparation rather than bravery, the steadiness of a woman who had thought through the problem before the problem arrived. "I wasn't brave," she said. "I was prepared." "People who've never prepared for anything think those are different things," Hattie said. "People who have prepared understand they're the same thing, said twice." The letter from Deputy Holt came in September, delivered by Hattie, with a particular look that told Clara it was not routine correspondence before she opened it. It was not routine. Silas Crow and the surviving members of the Black Coyote Riders had been tried in territorial court in August. Crow had received a sentence that would keep him incarcerated for the foreseeable future. 3 of his men had taken lesser sentences in exchange for testimony. The remaining group were being held pending additional proceedings. At the bottom of the letter, Holt had written a postscript in a hand slightly different from the formal body of the document, the handwriting of a man writing something he felt rather than something required. "Mrs. Boone, I have been in this work for 21 years. I have written my share of reports about things that went badly and people who did not rise to what was asked of them. It is rare to write about the other kind. The report I filed on the events at your property in May is the other kind. Crow is a capable and dangerous man who has beaten better positioned people than you and your husband. He did not beat you. I think you should know I said that in the report. Holt." Clara read it twice. She folded it and put it in the same place she kept her father's watch, the small cedar box on the shelf in her room that had started with a photograph and a folding knife, and had accumulated, over these months, the small documents of a life actually being lived. She put it beside the photograph. That evening, she sat on the porch in her chair, that was how she thought of it now, without deciding to, and watched the mountains do their evening work. Elias was beside her in his. The light moved the way it always moved. The birds made their count. Holt's letter came, she said. I know. Hattie told me what was in it. He was looking at the peaks. How do you feel about it? She thought about that. Not the quick version, the real version, taking stock of what she actually felt, rather than what she was supposed to feel. I feel like it's important, but not as important as I thought it would be, she said. Months ago, I would have needed someone to say that, to have it in writing, from someone with authority, that what I did meant something. I would have needed it the way a person needs water. She looked at the mountains. Now I'm glad for it, but I don't need it the way I would have before. Elias was quiet. That's a change, he said. Yes. She pulled her shawl slightly. The evenings were cooling now. September in the Grantham Range had a bite to it that she was still calibrating to. I think the change happened somewhere between the flour sack and now. I can't tell you exactly where. Does it matter where? She considered. No, I suppose it doesn't. She looked at the sky above the peaks, the first stars appearing, the blue of the sky deepening toward the east. I'm different than I was. That's the part that matters. He looked at her. You are, he said, quietly, like it was something he had been watching happen and was only now saying out loud. She looked back at the stars and let that sit where it landed. Below the mountain, Silver Creek was Silver Creek. The same measurements and the same voices and the same arithmetic about who was worth what. But she was no longer in it. She was up here, in a place that had been cold and strange and frightening and had become, without her entirely noticing the moment it happened, her own. The mountains ran their conversation under the evening stars. Clara Whitmore, Clara Boone, sat in her chair on the porch of her home, and the word home no longer surprised her when she thought it. It was simply true. The first snow came in October, earlier than Elias had predicted, which he noted with the mild irritation of a man who has been reading a mountain for years and still gets surprised by it. Clara was putting up the last of the preserves when the flakes started, small and tentative at first, the way snow always begins, as though testing whether it will be welcome. She stood in the doorway watching it settle on the garden rows she had pulled and turned 2 weeks ago, on the woodpile she and Elias had spent 3 days stacking, on the rock shelf above the garden where she had once held a rifle and made a decision that still visited her sometimes in the early morning hours before full waking. Elias came around the side of the cabin and looked up at the sky. Early, he said. I noticed. Root cellars full, wood stacked. He looked at the garden. You got everything out in time. I got everything out in time because you told me in August that October can surprise you. He looked at her. You actually listened to that. I listen to most things you say. I've just learned to wait until I've thought about them before I respond. She stepped back from the doorway. Come inside, I have coffee. He came inside. This was the rhythm of it now. This was what a year on the mountain had built, not the dramatic architecture of what had happened in May, not the weight of the recovered watch, or the letter from Holt, or the first time she'd ridden down to the Henderson place with a basket of root vegetables. Those things were real, and they mattered, but they were not the substance of the life. The substance was this: coffee when it was cold, 2 chairs on the porch when it was not, the gradual accumulation of a shared language made mostly of shorthand and silence, and the particular ease of people who have stopped performing for each other. She poured. He sat. The snow came down outside the window. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. About the spring, about what we do with the cabin in the spring. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Dorothea's husband asked me last month whether we ever took in travelers. He had a cousin coming from the east, trying to get further into the territory, and he didn't know where to send him for a stop between the lower range and the northern valley. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think about it. She looked at her cup. I've been thinking about it. Elias was quiet, in the way that meant he was following closely. This cabin is bigger than 2 people need, she said. The lean-to could be converted, properly, with real walls and a stove. It's not a large project. She paused. There are people moving through this range every season, settlers, traders, men going north for work. Most of them have nowhere to stop. Hattie can only do so much from the lower range. Another pause. I'm not talking about a hotel. I'm talking about a place where someone can get a meal and a night out of the weather and directions from someone who actually knows the terrain. The snow continued outside. Elias turned his cup in his hands. You've planned this out, he said. I've been thinking about it for 2 months, and you're telling me now because the ground will be workable again in April. And if we're going to convert the lean-to, I need to know before winter, so I can plan what materials to order through Denison. She looked at him steadily. And because it's your home and your lean-to, and any decision about it belongs to both of us. He looked at the window. The snow was thickening now, the particular density of a storm that meant business. He was silent long enough that she began to recalibrate, wondering if she had miscalculated, if the thing she had assumed about where they had arrived was not where they had actually arrived. Then he said, the south wall of the lean-to needs to be rebuilt regardless. There's rot in 2 of the lower boards. She looked at him. If we're rebuilding the south wall, he said, it makes sense to extend the roofline at the same time. Better to do it all at once than twice. He looked at his cup. I'll write to Denison about lumber. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Thank you, she said. It's a good idea, he said, simply, like it was just a fact about the idea rather than a concession to her. She hid something in her expression that she did not want to make too large a thing of, because Elias was a man who retreated from sentiment that was applied too directly, and she had learned to honor that the same way she had learned to honor the varieties of his silence. But she felt it. The particular fullness of a moment where 2 people who came to each other through the worst kinds of arrangement discover that the arrangement has become something neither of them arranged. The winter was long, which winters in the Grantham Range always were. It was also, in a way she had not expected, one of the better periods of her life. Not comfortable. The cold was genuine, and the work of maintaining heat and food and the animals through the deep months was constant and unglamorous. The stove had a bad week in January, where it refused to draw properly, and she burned 2 meals, and Elias spent an entire morning on the roof clearing an obstruction in the flue, while she stood below feeling useless until he asked her to hold the rope, which she did until her hands hurt from the cold. But there was time, in the winter, that the other seasons didn't provide. Time when the weather closed in, and the trails were impassable, and there was nowhere to go and nothing to do in the evenings except be in the same room together. She read. He read. Sometimes they read the same book, which led to conversations that surprised her with their range. Elias had opinions about things she had not expected, strong ones, delivered in his usual compressed style, but with genuine force behind them. He told her about Eleanor in pieces, the way a man tells a story he has never told anyone, not chronologically, not deliberately, but in the way that the past surfaces when you're finally in a place warm and safe enough to let it. A thing Eleanor had said. A winter they had spent. The particular argument they had every spring about when to plant that Eleanor always started and Elias always lost. She was right about the timing, he admitted, one February evening, not looking up from his book. I know, Clara said. I've been using her timing. He looked up. The planting notes, she said. In the back of the natural history book, in her handwriting. I found them in the first spring and I've been using them. He was quiet. I should have told you, she said. No. He shook his head. No, it's... He paused. It's right that you're using them. She'd have wanted them used. He looked back at his book. She hated wasted information more than almost anything. Clara thought about that. About the woman whose name was written on book covers and whose planting notes were in the back of the natural history volume and whose timing Clara had been following through 2 growing seasons. About how a person can be gone and still be present in the practical world, in the notes they left, in the books they touched, in the way someone else learns to use what they knew. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Clara said. Yes, he said. She is. Present tense. Not past. She noticed. She didn't comment on it. Some things deserve to be left exactly where they are. Spring came back the way spring always came back to the Grantham Range. Reluctant, and then suddenly committed, as though it had been debating and finally made a decision. The ground thawed. The birds came back louder than memory. The creek below the cabin ran high and fast with melt, and Clara stood at the edge of it one morning in April, her boots wet to the ankle from misjudging the bank, and felt something she had been unable to name all winter finally name itself. She was happy. Not the performed happiness of a woman making the best of a situation. Not the relief of someone whose circumstances had improved from bad to tolerable. Actually happy. The kind that lives in the body rather than the head, that shows up as a physical ease rather than a decided position. She stood with wet boots in the April mud and felt it and let it be what it was. Elias found her there. He looked at her boots. He looked at her face. "You misjudged the bank," he said. "I did. You're smiling about it. I'm smiling about something else." She looked at the creek running high and bright in the morning light. "I'm trying to remember the last time I was happy before I came up here. Actually happy, not just not miserable. I'm trying to locate it, and I can't find it clearly." She paused. "I can find individual moments. My father on a Sunday. Reading by myself when I was young enough that no one was watching me read." She turned to look at him. "But not like this. Not as a condition. Not as the general state of things." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what to do with it," she admitted. "I keep waiting for it to stop." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It doesn't stop. It just changes shape sometimes." He looked at the creek. "There are weeks in winter where I forget it. Then something happens. The light on the peaks in February, when it comes at that particular angle, or coffee that's actually right, and I remember it's still there." She thought about that. About a man who had spent 7 years carrying grief in a place he loved, keeping himself going through winters of forgetting, sustained by small moments of remembering until the spring always came back. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "I'm glad Dennison knew of my situation," she said. Something moved through his face. Something he did not attempt to contain or manage. A brief, unguarded moment, the kind she had seen only a handful of times in all these months. Then it settled back into itself. "So am I," he said. He reached out and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not the kind of gesture that announces itself. Just his hand on hers. At the edge of an April creek, two people standing in the mud of a mountain spring, imperfect and tired and genuinely glad to be here. She turned her hand over and held his. They stood like that for a while, listening to the creek tell its one loud story, and then they walked back up to the cabin because there was work to do and lumber to receive, and a south wall that needed rebuilding and a lean-to that was going to become the first room of something larger than either of them had planned. The first traveler who stopped at the Boone cabin that summer was a young man heading north for mining work, tired and lost and profoundly grateful for a meal and a direction. Clara fed him, and Elias drew him a map on a scrap of paper that was better than anything he could have bought in a shop, and the young man left the next morning with the slightly dazed look of someone who expected nothing and received more than enough. He told people. People tell people. By the following spring, the word had moved through the range communities and down into the lower settlements and eventually, as things eventually did, into Silver Creek itself. There is a place in the Grantham Range, people said, where a man can stop for the night, where the woman who runs the house knows plant medicine and will look at your injury without making you feel like a burden, where the mountain man who lives there knows every trail and will give you honest directions without wanting anything for it. People said other things too. They said the woman who ran it had held 2 armed men at rifle point alone and come out of it with her hands steady. They said she had been sent up the mountain in a transaction that was not a marriage so much as a disposal, and had turned the place where she landed into something that the whole range knew about. They said she was a large woman. This was noted because people note such things, because the world has never found a way to entirely stop measuring women against its own preferred measurements, and that she seemed entirely indifferent to what people noted. That last part was not entirely accurate. She was not entirely indifferent. She simply no longer organized her life around it. There is a difference. The cedar box on the shelf in her room held, by the second summer, a photograph, a folding knife, her father's watch, a letter from Deputy Holt, and a short note from Dorothea Henderson that said, in Dorothea's cramped handwriting, "You are the best thing that has happened to this range in the years I've been here, and I want you to know I said that." It also held, tucked in the back, the letter from Margaret Whitmore about the watch, not as a wound to revisit, but as a document, evidence of where she had started and what she had believed about herself at the beginning of a story she had not known she was in the middle of. She kept it because forgetting where you came from is not the same as being free of it. You have to know the starting point to understand how far you've gone. There is something particular about the story of Clara Boone that stays with you, if you let it. Not the dramatic part, the rifle, the rock shelf, the two men in the yard. Those things happened and they mattered, but they are not the center of the story. The center is quieter than that. It is a woman in a flour sack, sent somewhere she didn't choose, who looked at where she landed and decided to understand it on its own terms rather than on the terms of the life she'd left. It is the slow work of learning. A stove, a garden row, a stone signal, a creek crossing. When learning requires admitting you don't know. It is the particular courage of letting someone see you before you've decided what they're allowed to see. Because here's the thing that Clara understood, finally, standing in the April mud with her boots wet and her hand held in the creek running its loud spring course past her feet. The people who told her she was worth less than she was, they were not describing a fact about her. They were describing a limit in themselves, a smallness of imagination, an inability to see past the surface of a person to the substance underneath. They were wrong. And the worst thing she could have done with their wrongness was believe it. She had believed it for a long time. Most people do. When enough voices say the same thing, you start to think that consensus is truth. But consensus is only what a particular group of people in a particular place with particular limitations happen to agree on. It is not a verdict unless you let it be. Clara Whitmore let it be the verdict for 19 years. Then she rode up a mountain in a trader's wagon with everything she owned in a flour sack, and she found a man who looked at her like a person on the first day and never stopped. And she found out what happens when you stop trying to become small enough to be acceptable and start simply being who you are in the space you have. What happens is a life. Not a perfect one. Not the kind that runs smoothly from one triumph to the next. A life with burned bread and frozen seeds and letters that arrive with teeth in them, and nights when the grief of other people's losses, and your own, sits heavy in the dark. A life with wet boots and hard winters, and work that is never finished, and a man who takes longer to say things than most people take to think them. But a life that is genuinely hers, built from her choices and her failures and her 2 minutes of advance warning on a rock shelf and her reorganized root cellar and her planting notes borrowed from a woman she never met and her father's watch ticking in a cedar box. Built from the slow, unglamorous, irreplaceable work of deciding what you're worth and refusing to revise it downward because someone else's arithmetic runs differently than your own. The mountains kept their conversation going, the same conversation they'd been having since long before any of them arrived, and would keep having long after. The snow came and went, the creek rose and fell, the garden came in, season after season, a little better each year as the soil learned what it was being asked to do. And at the cabin on the shelf below the tree line, with the good sight lines and the rebuilt south wall, and the room where travelers stopped, the light came in the east window every morning on the same 2 chairs, the same rough table, the same shelf of 32 books with names written in the covers of some of them. A life looked like this. It looked exactly like this.